Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final panel discussion for the update. We'll have an additional session for closing reflections following this panel. I'd like to introduce our two speakers and also the topic for this panel. We have two extremely distinguished speakers. Dr. Diego Fossati from the City University of Hong Kong is a prolific scholar on public opinion in Indonesia, voting behavior. And we also have Dr. Burhanuddin Muhtadi from the State Islamic University of Jakarta, and also one of Indonesia's leading pollsters. If you followed the presidential election debates, or if you watch political talk shows on television, I'm sure you're all very familiar with Burhan and his very sharp analysis. The topic for this panel is reassessing public support for democracy. And without further ado, I'll pass over to Diego to kick us off.
Thank you. All right, good morning, everyone. And before I start, I also would like to thank Tom and Eve for the great work that they have been doing for this year's update, and most importantly, for inviting me here. For a junior scholar with an interest in Indonesia, having the opportunity to be here, share your work, it's such a prestigious event in a place with such a history, really is something special. So I'm humbled and I'm very happy to be here. Also very excited to share some findings from preliminary findings from a project I've been working on with a colleague and friend at Griffith University, Ferran Martinez-y-Calma, who is a scholar of voting behavior. The question we ask here is, what do ordinary Indonesians mean by democracy? What do we understand democracy to be about? And what are the implications of this idea for the broader processes of democratic consolidation that we have been discussing here at the update yesterday and today? This is an important question, I believe. To appreciate its importance, you need to think of the background that Alan Eken yesterday in his keynote so eloquently discussed, the background of a global democratic backsliding. We know that democracy is in recession worldwide, and we know that this time is different in that democratic backsliding appears to be initiated by incumbents. It's more gradual. It's more likely to rely on consensus building rather than violence, as it was in the past. One thing that I would like to emphasize is that we often see these agents, these actors that are pushing authoritarian agendas, they will not overtly advocate for authoritarianism. They will not say our countries should become more of an autocracy, more authoritarians. Rather, they will adopt the language of democracy. They will present themselves as being hyper-democrats, if anything, to be the real Democrats. So the concept of democracy really is becoming more and more contentious, and it pays to focus on this, to pay particular attention. Another reason why it is important to ask what people understand democracy to be about is that we often think of political regimes of any kind, really, as having to deliver somehow, having to provide some outcomes that people care about, such as socioeconomic development, but also ensuring the rule of law, peace and order, stability, some fundamental civil liberties, and so forth. When democracies fall short of this objective, they don't deliver on their promises, then the stage is set for a legitimacy crisis. People may start to doubt the ability of democracy as a political regime to deliver this kind of things, and then may become more receptive of this rhetoric articulated by authoritarian agents who are trying to attack the legitimacy of democratic institutions. So very important to ask these questions. I believe, I hope you agree. What exactly do we mean by conceptions of democracies? How can you think of democracy? Well, there is a huge literature in political theory about this, of course, but I am not a theorist. Ferran is not a theorist either. So instead of going into that, we thought, why don't we rely on a framework that is more familiar to people like us who are empirically minded social researchers. And this framework is a variety of democracy, and many have already mentioned this. So you are already a bit familiar with this. It's a very big international data collection project, a lot of research coming out of this. In this framework, democracy is conceptualized as being constituted mainly by 5 components. I'm going to go over them quickly. The first is electoral, and this is a very basic one. Even if you stick to a minimalist definition of democracy, democracy has to be about free and fair elections, free media, basic levels of political competitiveness. The second dimension is liberal. Here, the emphasis on right, individual right, minority rights that have to be protected. Protected by what? By people who win elections, by majorities, by the tyranny of majorities. So there is all a system of checks and balances in place to do that in liberal democracies. From a deliberative perspective, democracies are places where decisions are taken on the basis of rational discussion, of a rational, balanced dialogues in which all points of view are considered, are understood, and people respect each other even when they disagree. Participatory democracy, instead, puts a lot of focus on the ability and the willingness of people, of ordinary citizens, to participate in civic and political life, especially in informal manner. So beyond elections, so to speak. For some theorists, this is a very, very important dimension of democracy. Finally, there is an egalitarian dimension of democracies. We know that in all cases, societies are often very unequal, and there are substantial segments of the populations who, because of material or immaterial constraints, are not really able to participate fully in democracy. So from this perspective, a democracy is only a democracy if it is able to address these inequalities so that everybody is included in the democratic process. So this is basically the question and the way we've been thinking about it. We've been conceptualizing things, but let's get to Indonesia. What do we know about conceptions of democracies there? Well, many of us have done survey work, have worked with data from public opinion. We have learned that Indonesians are generally quite enthusiastic, very positive about democracies, highly supportive, but we also know that in some ways this doesn't really matter, because what really matters is what they actually mean by democracy. And a lot of the literature is actually focused on measuring the level of support, not for democracy, but for liberalism in the Indonesian public opinion. And Ed Aspinall, for example, in his presentation yesterday, mentioned this project that compares liberal and democratic attitudes between Indonesian politicians and the mass public, showing that overall the levels of support for liberalism are pretty low in democracy. And this is actually also the case for other Asian countries in which conception of democracies, this is the consensus in the literature, have a fairly strong egalitarian flavor. People tend to equate democracy with the ability of a political regime to deliver outcomes of interest, rather than with procedural or with liberal elements of democracy. This is, of course, very good research and a great starting point, but there are some issues in how we measure conceptions of democracies, I believe. One is that often some of these dimensions of democracy, especially the participatory and the deliberative dimension, they tend to be neglected in existing research. We focus a lot on this dichotomy of whether people understand democracy in a liberal or egalitarian term, and we forget that these two may also come in the picture. A second issue is that we often ask survey questions in a way that forces respondents to make a choice. For example, we tell them, here about these are 4 things that democracy may do. In your opinion, which is the most important one? So we force them to make a choice, but of course, conceptions of democracies are not necessarily mutually exclusive. There might be the possibility that people actually subscribe to multiple conceptions of democracies, and they could be quite conflated in the minds of the public. So Ferran and I, we thought maybe we could contribute by developing a new way of measuring democratic conceptions of democracies that allows for this, that allows people to have multiple conceptions, to express multiple views of what democracy is about, and to see how they are related, and also to explore more fully the relationship with other democratic attitudes, such as satisfaction with democracy and support for democracy. So how do we do that? With a survey conducted online, which is very similar to what Chris presented this morning, basically. A web survey that is not representative of the Indonesian population because it is made by people who actually choose to do this. It's not really randomly selected. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. But that said, we do have like quite substantial heterogeneity in the sample in terms of having people of different backgrounds, different religious, education attainment, and so forth. So what do we do to measure conceptions of democracies is this. We depart from that schema of like 5 conceptions of democracy, and for each of these we ask, what are exactly the feature, the traits of a political system that according to these conceptions of democracy are really, really important? According to a liberal, to a participatory, deliberative conception of democracies, and so forth. I'm going to give you a couple of examples in the next slide. So, but the idea is, let's try to translate this in more like these big dimensions, in more measurable sort of items that people could respond to, that people could understand and evaluate. So we ask to our respondents, what do you think? People have different ideas about like what it means to be a democracy. So here is a list of statements. For each of them, please tell us how important do you think it is for a democracy to have this specific feature? And here are a few examples. We have 36 of that, as I mentioned. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can read them while I talk, but I'm just giving you a couple of examples. For example, if we think of democracy in deliberative terms, then we think decisions have to be taken to advance the common good, have to be taken with a rational discussion. All points of view have to be considered. Another example from a liberal standpoint, there we care a lot about the rule of law, the law being the same for all citizens. Checks and balances between different branches of government, individual rights, and so forth. So this is what we are doing, and the idea, again, is to translate into these 5 dimensions into smaller pieces that ordinary people who are not theorists of democracy can respond to. What do we find? Oh no, well, before doing that, how do we analyze the data? We run some factor analysis. This is for those of you who are not familiar with this. In a nutshell, it is a method that often is, sometimes is used in survey research, and you use that when you have a fairly large number of variables. In this case, we have 36. And so there is a lot of variation going on, but you're trying to reduce that complexity to a very limited number of underlying factors, of underlying dimensions that make sense analytically, conceptually, and that allow you to really like analyze the variation in a more efficient, in an easier to understand way. So this is what we do, and that allows us to ask questions such as how many conceptions of democracies are there in Indonesia, how did they relate to our conceptual framework, and so on and so forth. So these are our findings. We find that in Indonesia there are 2 main conceptions of democracy. The first is the one on the left, and it could be considered like the dominant in some ways, meaning that these dimensions really explain most of the variation in how people respond to the 36 items. I have called it an egalitarian/liberal dimension of democracy. Why is it? Because if you look at the specific items that are most closely associated with these dimensions, you will find that a lot of them, well, most of them, at least those who are most strongly associated with it, are either liberal or egalitarian in nature. They come from these 2 dimensions. So if you look at the first one, this is the statement, the item that is most closely associated with this dimension. It is a very liberal one. The idea that citizens have the same rights regardless of their age, race, and ethnicity. Following like 4 items that are all egalitarians, they're about policy outcomes. If the list were to go on, you will find even more liberal items. I think the 6th one is people are free to profess their religion freely, whatever it is. So the 2 things, we often think of them, as I mentioned before, in dichotomous terms, but they seem to be conflated here in the minds of Indonesian people. The people we survey don't really seem to be making like a difference between these two. They both see them as being closely related and in their conception of democracy. There is, however, a second dimension of democracy, and this is related to the first one, but also empirically it is distinct. And this is something a bit novel that we are uncovering here, and that is a participatory dimension of democracy. There are people in our sample who believe democracy is mostly about participation, especially informal participation. If you look at the items that are most closely associated with these second dimensions, you will find it is a mix of participatory and electoral items where the emphasis is on participation beyond elections. Things like citizens are engaged, are interested in political issues, they discuss politics with people they know, they can discuss politics in public, they are free to demonstrate and protest. So this is why I'm calling it a participatory dimension. So this is the findings in terms of like factor analysis. The second step is to try to explore the implications of these two conceptions of democracy in the Indonesian public. So we ask either related to satisfaction with and support for democracies. We have three outcome variables that we're interested in. The first two are about satisfaction. First, we ask, do you believe Indonesia is a democracy? Is it a full democracy, a democracy with minor problems, with major problems, or not a democracy at all? The second question is, are you satisfied with how democracy is being run now in Indonesia? The third is a bit different from the first two in that it tests a bit more like support for democracy as a system of government rather than satisfaction with democracy with how it's running now in Indonesia. So it is a question of do you agree or disagree that democracy is the best form of government for Indonesia? So we do some regression analysis. We control for a lot of different variables, socioeconomic, demographic, region, and so forth. I'm happy to talk more about how exactly we do this. But basically, our idea is to try to identify the effect of conceptions of democracies on these three outcomes. And this is what we find here. I'm showing you a very, very selective slice of the findings, of course. This is the coefficients and the standard errors estimated in regression analysis for the three models. We start with egalitarian liberal conceptions of democracies. What do those numbers mean? Well, look at the first two columns, Model 1 and Model 2. These are the models where the outcomes is satisfaction with democracy. As you can see, the coefficient is negative, and it's also significant. This means that people who have a strong, well-defined egalitarian liberal conception of democracy, they are more likely to be dissatisfied with how democracy is working today in Indonesia. They are more likely to say Indonesia is not a democracy, or it is a democracy with very major flaws. So they're more critical, okay? However, if you look at Model 3, you see that this kind of negative relationship does not extend to also support for democracy in more abstract terms as a political regime. Having a strong egalitarian liberal conception of democracy does not make you any less likely to believe that democracy is good for Indonesia, despite you being very critical of how democracy is being run right now in Indonesia. So there is a big difference between the two things here. What about participatory Democrats? Well, here we find something unexpected. We didn't really expect to see this. As you can see, the coefficient for the first two models is actually positive. So one thing that we didn't expect is that people who have this kind of idea of democracy not being about really like socioeconomic outcomes or liberal principle, democracy being about participation, opportunities to participate in politics beyond elections, people who are participatory Democrats are actually more happy, more satisfied with how democracy is being run, is like working today in Indonesia. They are also more likely to say Indonesia is a full democracy. Indonesia is a democracy, but with only minor problems. So there is a pretty clear bifurcation here. And you're seeing that, I guess we're seeing it's a fairly clear relationship between different types, different conceptions of democracies and satisfaction with democracy. So I think this is suggestive of the fact that it might be worth looking more into different conceptions and exploring more fully the full conceptual range of what it might mean to be a democracy. So, just to conclude with a couple of remarks on what is the relevance of these findings, of these preliminary findings from this project, for the debate we've been having the last 2 days about the prospects for democracy in Indonesia. Well, one thing is that we find this very strong relationship between conceptions of democracy and how people evaluate how democracy is going in Indonesia, whether they like what they see. So it really depends on what you mean democracy to be about, whether or not you're happy with the current political situation in Indonesia. And we see a fairly clear bifurcation, a difference between the two. People who are more critical, who are more unhappy, are those who understand democracy in liberal and egalitarian terms. So that suggests to me that this is an area in which Indonesia should be particularly focusing its effort to address the expectations of the mass public, being able to deliver in these two things. I have also shown that for now, this does not really translate in an outright rejection of democracy as a form of government, but dissatisfaction is there, and if frustration persists in that, it could be, in the long term, a bigger problem, also in terms of support for democracy. Finally, second point I want to make is that of association, the relationship between conceptions of democracy and support for democracy, the principles of democracy, so to speak. Here we see that no matter what conceptions you have of democracy, regardless of whether you are an egalitarian, a liberal, or a participatory Democrat, people who have a stronger, a better defined, a more coherent understanding of what a democracy is, they are more supportive of democracy. The more you know democracy, the more you love it, so to speak. And I think this is an interesting finding. It suggests that people who might be especially critical here, who might represent a challenge for democracy in Indonesia of the future, are the people who don't have any conception of whatsoever of democracy. And these people are people who have a very low degree of educational attainment, and they are young people. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diego, for that fantastic presentation. We'll go straight on to Mas Burhan. Monggo, Mas.
Very good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to extend my deepest thanks to ANU Insun Project, especially Eve and Tom, for the opportunity to speak here. It's always happy to be back in this beautiful but quiet city. Yeah, I just remember what Hatib Basri jokingly said. He was ANU PhD graduate and former Minister of Finance. He said that Jakarta is a city without plan, Canberra is a plan without city. Okay, I just want to back to my topic. So this is the caption that accompanies a video that went viral on social media platform and WhatsApp group during the release of the result of the election by the KPU. So fraudulent election have been shown by the Joko Widodo regime, which damaged the image of Indonesia in the eyes of the world. Democracy is already dead in Indonesia. So the viral video refers to Al Jazeera TV, and Al Jazeera immediately made a letter of clarification arguing that it had been edited and was given a caption that was taken out of context. Although it has been disputed, Prabowo supporters firmly believe that they were cheated, triggering massive protests outside the headquarters of Election Supervisory Agency Bawaslu, causing at least 10 protesters killed and 100 more injured in Indonesian worst riot since 1998 unrest that topple longtime dictator Suharto. In the literature on democratic consolidation, democratic stability is often not determined by who wins the election, but rather by the loser. As Alan Hicken mentioned yesterday, if electoral loser become disillusioned with democracy and then fail to subscribe into democracy as the only game in town, this can ultimately lead to democratic deconsolidation. And the problem gets worse if they incite violence, encourage coup, or support for the revival regime, former regime. So while elections have been held regularly in Indonesia, surprisingly, little work has been done to investigate how electoral losers react to their electoral defeat, whether they remain to support democracy as the only game in town, whether they express higher level of support for nostalgia for authoritarian regime after having cast a vote for the losing side of the election. So accordingly, in this paper, I test both democratic satisfaction and democratic preference and examines whether the winner-loser effect on satisfaction and explore whether the gap in democratic satisfaction different from or congruent with the belief of democracy as an ideal type of political system. So this study relies heavily on national public opinion surveys conducted through face-to-face interviews, as I have been involved with 2 polling organizations based in Jakarta, LSE and Indicator. I have an access to a database containing multi-year data set on the same or similar measure. So I'm able to track change in attitudes among electoral losers in Indonesia since the first direct presidential election 2004. And this multi-year opinion data can tell us much about whether the effect of losing or winning in election on satisfaction is stable over time or not. And if there are fluctuation, I just want to look at whether they have been influenced by key events in Indonesian politics. So before further presentation, I just want to set out my big argument. At least we have 4 points. First, using pre and post-election survey data between 2004, 2009, 2014, and 2019, I find that being a supporter of the losing candidate significantly increased the likelihood of becoming disillusioned with the way democracy works. Second, electoral losers in 2019 are also more likely to perceive the election was less free and fair. Similarly, the loser were also convinced that their freedom of speech, their freedom of organization are being undermined. Third, despite their painful electoral defeat, they still think that democracy as the best form of government. My post-election survey data also tell us that Prabowo supporters didn't express higher level of support for the new order authoritarian period compared to pre-election surveys. And lastly, despite electoral losers are still committed to democracy as the best form of government over other form of government, the evidence, the findings surrounding 2019 election provide strong evidence of democratic deterioration across multiple indicators. So to begin with, I present the aggregate level of satisfaction in Indonesia at 13 points in time from before the first direct presidential election 2004 to the most recent presidential election 2019. And this figure demonstrates that while the level of satisfaction fluctuates substantially over time, a pattern emerged. Indonesians generally tend to be more satisfied after an election. In 2004, overall democratic satisfaction rating rose significantly pre to post-election. Similarly, satisfaction also increased after the election in 2009 and 2014. The 2019 election figure, however, present a dramatic shift in pattern of satisfaction. For the first time in 1.5 decades, the overall satisfaction dropped significantly after the election. So when we disaggregate the level of satisfaction based on electoral result, this figure demonstrates that electoral loser more likely to be unsatisfied with the functioning of political system. Prior 2004 election, for example, those who supported Megawati, the incumbent Megawati, who ran for election at the time, expressed higher level of satisfaction than those who supported the challenger, Yudhoyono. Even my survey in early September, conducted just after Megawati lose in the first round, showed that Megawati supporters still display more positive evaluation of democracy. But the picture changed after the runoff ended up on the victory of Yudhoyono. Those who voted Megawati suddenly became more disillusioned, while Yudhoyono voters who were previously disillusioned changed their views to be more satisfied with democracy. And of course, the effect of losing is not only limited to democratic satisfaction, but also other aspects of civil democracy quality. First, the table compare electoral loser and winner perception, whether an election was conducted fairly based on exit poll that were conducted immediately after respondents cast their vote at polling station, and post-election survey that were fielded after the official results were released. And given that respondents of the exit poll were still convinced that their candidate would win, overwhelming majority of respondents considered the election as fair and free. However, post-election data show the change. Electoral losers were more likely to think that elections were not fair after the election were released. But losers in 2019 who assessed their views on the integrity of election are more striking compared to two previous elections. So total effect of being declared lost in 2019 amount to 53% decline in confidence in the election. Relatedly, Saiful Mujani Research and Consulting post-election data in 2019, and you can compare with 2009 and 2014 with the same measure that they use, show a decline in public confidence in some indicators of democratic quality. So they find ample evidence of democratic deterioration of people, because now people are now feeling much more cautious when discussing political issues. Respondents feel uneasy due to indiscriminate crackdown by apparatus. They also feel that freedom of assembly comes under pressure. In 2019, they also admitted that freedom to practice faith suffers due to increasing intolerance in Indonesian society at large. When we break down, Prabowo supporters in 2019 are more likely to assess that the trend of democratic regression is rising, while Jokowi supporters tend to give democracy high marks, except on the issue of being afraid to talk about politics. In theory, voters are more likely to assess democracy in positive fashion when it produces the result that they desire. But however, if you look at 2009, 2014, the result released the contradict with the prior research. The right and left panel of this figure show that there is almost no difference between winners and losers feeling about multiple indicators of democratic deterioration surveyed in 2009, 2014. In 2019, however, winners and losers begin to think differently about how well democracy works. Those who voted for the losing candidate more likely to believe that there is a rise in the arbitrary state crackdown on freedom of speech and organization, and deterioration in the protection of minority rights. So the question is, why was the gap between winners and losers so big in 2019? I argue that the contentious nature of 2019 election with an increased polarization along with Prabowo's behavior and Jokowi government hardline approach to opposition figure contribute to the widening gap between winners and losers. Many scholars characterize 2019 election campaign as the most polarized in Indonesian history, especially after Reformasi era. If and Ed Aspinall argue that 2019 election was a result of polarizing between Islamists and pluralists that had re-emerged since 2014, and facing a limited support from political parties and financial issues in his second presidential bid, Prabowo relied more heavily on Islamist group in 2019 than in 2014. And in response to the challenge from the Islamists, the Jokowi administration took harsh measures, including the banning of Hizbut Tahrir, who took the street against Jokowi ally during the Islamist mobilization 2016-2017 through the regulation in lieu of law on mass organization, and the use, of course, the use of the electronic information and transaction law to criminalize political opponents. Ironically, the heightened sense of polarization caused many of Jokowi supporters to accept such heavy-handed approach, and at the same time, Prabowo continuously discredited the election, claiming that the election was rigged and full of fraud and deceit. All of this explains why the gap between losers and winners was so pronounced in 2019. So having painted the picture of how different the loser feel about democratic satisfaction and other aspects of democratic quality, we are now in position to examine whether the relationship between the two is not spurious and stable over time. So as you can see from the model first, model 1, the bivariate analysis as shown in model 1 suggests that being a loser lead to a decrease in satisfaction in 2004, 2009, 2014, 2019. Model 2 shows that the relationship between electoral result and satisfaction in 2004, 2009, 2019 are not spurious when controlled by other variables, including political attitudes and demographic variable. But 2014 data show that the loser effect lose its significance when introduce other variable. So I have presented that losing election can induce strong feeling of dissatisfaction and higher level of distrust in the election integrity. What remains unclear is that whether such disillusionment lead to a rejection of democracy as a whole. Previous studies have indicated that losers not only to be more disillusioned with democracy, but their commitment to democracy as an ideal type of political system erode. The initial finding in Indonesia, however, find no evidence for prior expectation. It turns out that overall support for democracy as the best form of government has still been high and relatively stable before and after the election. So this is when we break down based on the electoral result. There is no big difference in the state of normative commitment to democracy among winners and losers. In 2019, losers' support for democracy remained high at 71.5% even after the election end up on the defeat of Prabowo. So simply put, Prabowo supporters' anger over the defeat leads them to view that political process are unfair, democracy is in decline, but they do not lose their faith in democracy. So the last slide before conclusion, in the literature, in order to become consolidated, democracy also requires the public to distance themselves from the past authoritarian regime. So I measure popular nostalgia about the past authoritarian regime by using an index created from 8 questions. So whether respondents agree or disagree, compare with the present democratic regime. During Suharto era, Indonesia was much more respected, economic performance was better, the government was more effective, economy was more just and equitable, people were more prosperous, corruption was less, minorities were better protected, and people were more free. Each of these items is a 5-point scale. So an authoritarian nostalgia index then developed based on the answer from the question above. So a score between 66.67 to 100, that is a respondent answered all questions or almost all questions in the affirmative, led to the classification as authoritarian nostalgists. A score between 33.33 to 66.67 indicated the categorization as neutral, and score 0 to 33 indicated the category non-nostalgist. And based on this scheme, 21.8% Indonesian had strong feeling of authoritarian nostalgia and 14.4% non-nostalgist. Overall, this number changed slightly compared to pre-election surveys. However, a close analysis of post-election cross-tabulation indicate that Prabowo supporters more likely to express nostalgia for the authoritarian past, 33.7% compared to 12% who voted for Jokowi and leaning to authoritarian nostalgia. But compared to pre-election data, the percentage of Prabowo supporters who were inclined to authoritarian rule increased only slightly. And my significant tests show that there is no significant difference between pre and post-election among Prabowo supporters. So the conclusion still holds that despite Prabowo supporters' painful electoral defeat, feeling of authoritarian nostalgia do not significantly increase among Prabowo supporters. So the last slide, I think this is, to my knowledge, the first attempt at detailed examination of the relationship between electoral outcome and democratic support. And overall, my study found that while being a winner increased satisfaction with democracy, being part of political minority undermined satisfaction. So electoral loser more likely to believe that the political process unfair, democracy is deteriorating, but they do not lose democracy as the only game in town. And lastly, despite their grievance about the election, they're still willing to remain committed to democracy, but their willingness to support democracy should not be taken for granted. So if democracy continues to deteriorate, and they still experience more limitation of free speech and organization, then they may feel justified in experiencing disillusionment and anger over the defeat of Prabowo. So due to this imminent possibility, the decline in democratic indicators must be overcome so that electoral losers do not waver in keeping their faith in democracy and do not start flirting with the idea of changing democratic system. I will stop my presentation here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mas Burhan. It's fantastic to finish the panel discussions with two empirically rich and very sharply analysed papers. So we'll move on to questions. Now, both our speakers kept perfectly to time, so I ask that all questioners also keep in mind the time constraints when asking questions. Just one question for each speaker, and keep them nice and direct. Okay, so we have one question here. Risa and Ben. Yep.
Shall I start?
Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you. Untuk Mas Burhan. Since yesterday, I believe that the decline in Indonesian democratic quality has been strongly associated with the political polarizations. Has been on and on since yesterday. So, and if you want to see the culprit of this one, probably Jokowi is the culprit. Why he has to be there in 2014, and to a large extent, and to a small extent, why he has to be there in 2012, running in the Jakarta gubernatorial elections. But by the end of the day, if we have to accept that one, at this point in time, 2019, this has been destiny. We can't go back. So, and then unfortunately, Indonesia will still will have to see him for the next 5 years there at the top job. So my question is, taking into account that kind of destiny, and then the problem of political polarizations, for better or worse, so what would be the future of Indonesian democracy beyond Jokowi, and what would be the future of, I mean, the prospect of Indonesian democracy? Are we going to see the continuity of such polarizations of Islamist, pluralist, that kind of thing? And then, is there any
just
democratic
one
engineering that can be invented or can be done to overcome that kind of polarizations? Thank you.
Yeah, Risa.
Thank you for the papers. I find them both very, very interesting. My question has to do with Diego's instruments, though. How different are the people that you categorize across the two different categories? So the people who value inclusivity and those who value participatory norms of democracy. Are there, I would imagine there would be a number of respondents who would actually fall somewhere in the middle. And do your results change when you actually shift the threshold quite a bit? And what happened to those people who are kind of in the middle? Like, would they report very different results in terms of their supports for democracy? And I think it would actually benefit your presentation of your results if you actually include those people whom you call as the ones who don't actually know democracy, and how they actually differ in their behavior and their support for democracy.
Great, thanks. And to Ben, yeah.
Thanks. It's a question for Mas Burhan as well, and it builds on the first question. So how far do you think this polarization and the frustration of the losers is a function of the fact that the two same candidates have faced off against each other twice? And what does that imply about the next election, when there will be a whole new constellation of candidates and parties?
Great, thanks.
All right, so thanks for the great question. Yeah, this is something I I thought about myself a bit. The reason why we don't do that, we haven't invested much time in trying to come up with this type of this kind of typologies, if you will. And part of the reason is that, as I mentioned, we don't really have a representative sample. So I think, like, you know, in general, I would ask that kind of questions with when I have a sample that is very much reflective of the broader population. So you can say 20% of Indonesians are egalitarian Democrats as opposed to a liberal or a participatory Democrat. This is something that I very much look forward to do in further research, and hopefully when I have enough money to pay Burhan for for a proper survey. But what we have done so far is basically to try to look into demographic and social correlates of these two conceptions of democracy. Basically looking at this, ideational conceptions of democracies as outcomes. What we find is that there is a much difference in terms of demographic profile of those who are participatory as opposed to liberal egalitarian democrats. No differences in, in terms of like income, education, and so forth. The only difference between the two is perhaps more of an ideological one. If you look at, for example, at attitudinal orientation that predicts whether or not someone is a liberal egalitarian democrat, you will find that people who are Islamists, people who support a larger role for Islam in political life, they are less likely to subscribe to this point of view. So this is an interesting finding also because it tells us that it is a good idea to call this dimension as not only egalitarian but also a liberal one. By contrast, if you look at determinants of the more participatory dimension, there you see that it seems to be associated with populist sentiments. So there is a correlation with these two broad, ideologies, so to speak, or thin ideologies that dominate Indonesian politics.
Okay. I don't know exactly what kind of democratic engineering that we can do to solve this problem, but I think we have what Anderson and his colleague called as democratic bargain. This disappeared in Indonesian democracy after the election in 2019. So after the winning side emerged, after a heated competition, it is imperative basically what Alan said yesterday about how the loser and the winners struck in a democratic bargain. So the winners do not harass the loser. And the loser need to concede and give a chance to the legitimate rule to win, to a legitimate winner to rule. So it's kind of, tit for tat democratic culture to ensure that the democracy survive, the legitimacy of democracy sustain. So this is the traditional way to solve the problem. So give a chance for the loser. So what Adam Przeworski said, no one imagine action outside democratic institution, and there is no that the loser can do except try again within the same institution under which they lose. So give a chance for Prabowo to run again 2024. And what is it? I just read a paper, interesting paper written by Grewal and Munro from Princeton about electoral loser in Tunisia and Egypt. And I found very interesting there. And based on their research, it's clear that the secularists in both countries more likely to reject democracy, while Islamists in Tunisia and Egypt more likely to support democracy. Because if their election, the Islamists won the election, and secularists lose. But if we look at Indonesia, Indonesia is Muslim predominantly country, 88% Indonesian are Muslim, and since 1955 election, they never win the election. Even after Reformasi era, you can see no big Islamic political party who received, more than 15%. They always lose. But the good news from my finding is that despite they lose in election, they do not lose their faith in democracy, despite they never win the election.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but maybe we can take one more question from the floor. Yep, down the back.
Thank you, Eva from ANU. My question is for Diego, and perhaps Burhan also can add. So, in one of the table shows within the liberal democracy, one of the components is gender equality. So I thought when I saw that one, well, that's great because we haven't touched enough since yesterday this aspect. So I'm just wondering whether you could elaborate more the interplay between democracy and gender equality, and in the context of Indonesia, of course, religion. Perhaps Mas Burhan can add a little bit more. Do you see gender divide in the way the supporters evaluate how democracy works? The politics of emak-emak, for example, the power of emak-emak post presidential elections.
Thanks.
Thanks. Great question. There are a limited number of items that are very limited. They are not associated with any conception of democracy. They seem to be completely unrelated with how Indonesians are thinking of democracy. One of them is people have the same rights regardless of their sexual orientations. This doesn't appear to be, any relationship with conceptions of democracy. Another one is about gender. Women and men participate in politics equally. This was designed by us as one of the participatory kind of items, and we were expecting it to load on this dimension, to correlate with this. But we find that it isn't the case. So there are other statements that are a little bit closer to the egalitarian, liberal components. But overall, I think the picture that is emerging is that of issues of gender and sexual minorities too, as not having a very strong bearing in how Indonesians, or at least those we have interviewed, conceptualize and understand democracy.
Okay.
Yeah. I just want to add one thing. First, if we look at the data before and after election, basically women were more likely to vote for Jokowi than Prabowo Sandi. So basically, the campaign, the power of emak-emak really failed. So men more likely to vote for Prabowo. I don't know why, but this is the data that we have. And then another thing that maybe we can do more is that I found something really stable in my data when we look at, gender divide in terms of supporting conservatism, for example. Women more likely to be more conservative than men. So yeah, that's the data that we have, but I don't know.
Sounds very familiar. Yeah.
Okay. Please join me in congratulating and thanking both of our speakers.
Thanks.
Fantastic papers.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is the sad time of the conference. It's nearly over. It's time for an overview and reflections. We have two. We are blessed with two. There will be no Q&A. So look very thoughtful as you absorb the reflections you hear. You've always looked thoughtful, might I say. So it'll be 2 lots of 15 minutes, and the first is pre-recorded. It is Dr. Dan Slater, a political scientist, very well known for his long-term observing of Indonesia and as a comparativist. He's director of the VISA, or perhaps Visa Center for Emerging Democracies at the University of Michigan. The strong shall inherit historical foundations of Indonesia's surprising democratic success. And over to the technicians.
Hello, everybody from Ann Arbor. Thanks to everybody, especially to Eve and Tom, for inviting me and accommodating me. I know my time is limited, so please forgive me for beginning abruptly and without further ceremony. To be a new democracy is to be confronted by a series of pitfalls. When democracy is born, in what some scholars of democratization call a hard place for democracy, these pitfalls are especially deep and dauntingly numerous. Indonesia has been perhaps the hardest place, and thus the biggest surprise, of any case where democracy has arisen and, for the most part, succeeded in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. But explaining democratic success requires thorough attention to the variety of ways that democracies can fail. My argument for why Indonesian democracy has surprisingly succeeded centers on the historical inheritances the country possessed when transitioning to democracy in what appeared to be the hardest imaginable circumstances in 1998 and 99. More specifically, egalitarian nationalism, inherited from before the authoritarian period, and institutional developments inherited from the authoritarian period itself. I argue that these historical inheritances best explain why Indonesia has managed to avoid the 4 major pitfalls that new democracies so often confront. Number 1, state failure. Number 2, military takeover. Number 3, electoral authoritarianism. And number 4, illiberal democracy. However, I also argue that Indonesia has not fully escaped and never can fully escape the 4th and final danger, illiberal democracy. Whether Indonesia will avoid succumbing to an illiberal democratic fate depends largely on whether its deep but increasingly distant inheritance of egalitarian nationalism can withstand the challenges of those who would undermine and undo it. Indeed, it has been Indonesia's lingering vulnerability to illiberal democracy that explains the softness in the country's democracy rating, and I imagine most of the concerns about Indonesian democracy voiced at this conference. But it is vital to appreciate that the other 3 main threats to a young democracy in a hard place like Indonesia, state failure, military takeover, and electoral authoritarianism, have all been successfully evaded, and I expect those critical evasions to continue. In the full version of my paper, I talk at some length about how Indonesia's nationalist movement and revolution built a relatively egalitarian nationalism, both in class and ethno-religious terms, and how Indonesia's authoritarian new order built relatively effective party and state organizations. Given my limited time today and the extensive Indonesian knowledge of this audience, I will skip that historical detail in my talk and focus on how these 2 key inheritances have helped Indonesia avoid 4 pitfalls. At least 4 distinct pitfalls tend to confront new democracies, and Indonesia was no exception. A new democracy can experience state failure if governance fails and either the country falls apart in civil war or separatism, or ruling elites take extreme authoritarian measures to prevent such outcomes from arising. It can also fall through military takeover if men in fatigues refuse to accept the hindrances that democratic politics presents. In less extreme scenarios, democracy can backslide into electoral authoritarianism if politicians start doing whatever they want to win elections, or illiberal democracy if they start doing whatever they want after winning them. How has Indonesia avoided all 4 of these undemocratic fates? More specifically, how have Indonesia's inheritances of egalitarian nationalism and authoritarian era institutional development helped the country steer clear of these multiple sharp shoals? State failure loomed especially large as a potential outcome during Indonesia's tumultuous transition years. The provinces of East Timor, Aceh, and West Papua all presented credible separatist claims. Ethnic and religious violence erupted in various parts of the archipelago, most notably in the eastern Indonesian districts of Ambon, Maluku, and Poso. Riots against Indonesia's ethnic Chinese minority hit as close to home as Jakarta itself. Islamist terrorism delivered repeated blows, most infamously in Bali. Leading country experts quite seriously asked whether the republic could endure without the military holding it all together by force. Less than a decade removed from the collapse of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, the notion that power holders in Jakarta would fail to keep the country intact and minimally governable was far from far-fetched. Inheritances of strong nationalism and a strong state proved up to the many challenges, however. Remarkably in hindsight, and even in real time, East Timor was permitted to exit Indonesia by popular referendum, though pro-integration militias long backed by the Indonesian military inflicted a horrible price on East Timor's people for so choosing. Not only was it remarkable that East Timor was allowed to secede, equally remarkable was the lack of separatist sentiment in other parts of the archipelago which, like East Timor, had sizable Christian majorities. Even as Christian communities feared eradication in the deadly religious conflicts that erupted in demographically divided districts like Ambon and Maluku, no wider push for Christian separation and self-determination gathered steam. In part, this was because national politicians invoked the pluralistic version of nationalism, embodied by the concept of Pancasila, in their condemnations of religious violence. Christians might not have been made to feel at home in certain areas, but their rightful place in the Indonesian nation was never seriously questioned. The Indonesian state also came decisively to the rescue of the country's founding unity and diversity ideal. Steeled by over 3 decades of military rule, the Indonesian military and security services were quickly deployed to conflict zones across the archipelago and restored peace in surprisingly short order. A national policy of decentralization also allowed divided provinces to split, making local ethno-religious conflict less intractable. Islamist terrorism was also effectively snuffed out by highly professionalized intelligence services. In sum, state failure was avoided because the Indonesian nation was inclusive enough and the Indonesian state was capable enough to prevent the republic from violently unraveling. While the Indonesian military was strong enough to help keep the country together, it did not use this strength to reassume direct control of the political system. Herein lay perhaps the biggest surprise of Indonesian democratization. During the years preceding Suharto's fall, the overwhelming consensus among Indonesia watchers was that his new order would be followed by some variety of collective military rule. Yet this did not come to pass. The first reason was because Suharto had increasingly personalized, factionalized, and to some extent Islamicized the military during his final years in power. This left the Indonesian military as the country's most powerful actor, but not a highly cohesive actor, as Suharto exited the scene in the face of cascading mass protests and elite defections. This is not to say the military simply stepped aside. For the first 5 years of Indonesian democracy, the military retained a sizable proportion of appointed parliamentary seats, and prominent military officers played a major role in electoral politics. Indeed, Indonesia's first directly elected president, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, was one of the top military officials of the late Suharto era. Yet the military surrendered its parliamentary seats with nary a fuss in the constitutional revisions that followed democratization in plenty of time for the 2004 national elections. The best explanation for why the military has done so lies in Indonesia's party-state institutional inheritance. Electoral support in 1999 and 2004 did not flow to former radical opponents of the new order or to proponents of root and branch military reform, but to conservative and moderate parties and politicians with deep experience in Indonesia's military-led political system. Of particular importance was the continued leading role played by Golkar, which has remained one of Indonesia's top electoral performers and has consistently secured leading roles for itself in governing coalitions and cabinets. To the considerable extent that the military can continue to rely on the long-standing Golkar and bureaucratic pillars of political stability, there is simply no manifest reason for military men to dominate the civilian arena. Besides avoiding the fates of state failure and military takeover, Indonesian democracy has not backslid into electoral authoritarianism. This arises when one party or political leader gains majoritarian control through elections, then uses that control to stifle opposition and competition for the country's top political posts. The main reason Indonesia has been immune from electoral authoritarianism is its sheer scale and diversity, combined with the role of egalitarian nationalism in ensuring that Indonesia's vast array of ethnic and religious communities enjoy a rightful role to play in national political life. Golkar was unable to maintain the kind of majoritarian footing that could have allowed it to rebuild the electoral authoritarianism of the New Order era, as electoral support in 1999 flowed to the party vehicles of egalitarian nationalism, the PDIP, representing Indonesia's Sukarnoist, pluralist, Pancasila ideological stream, the PKB, channeling the world's largest Islamic social organization, the Nahdlatul Ulama, or NU, and PAN as the main vehicle for another massive Islamic group, the Muhammadiyah. All of these parties had roots in the ideological and institutional developments of the nationalist struggle and had maintained much of their vibrancy during the new order. If any party had prospects of capturing majority electoral support and imposing electoral authoritarianism from that perch, it was almost certainly PDIP, which, led by Sukarno's daughter, Megawati Sukarnoputri, secured over 33% of the 1999 parliamentary vote. Yet the robustness of Islamic parties, as well as the continued king-making role of Golkar, ensured that Megawati was brought into sweeping power-sharing arrangements rather than being allowed to rule alone, even after she was elevated to the presidency in 2001. If any politician and party have posed a threat of reestablishing electoral authoritarianism in Indonesia, it has been Prabowo Subianto and his populist party vehicle, Gerindra. After being dishonorably discharged from the military and spending a spell overseas, burnishing his economic fortunes, if not his political fortunes, Prabowo returned to the scene for the 2009 elections and garnered a spot as Megawati's running mate for the vice presidency, then rose to the top of the ticket in both 2014 and 2019. Both times, Prabowo was defeated by Jokowi, a member of PDIP and a stalwart of Indonesia's pluralist Pancasila tradition, by approximately a 55 to 45% margin. It is impossible to say with confidence whether Prabowo would have either attempted to undermine Indonesian democracy to the point that it would be better considered electoral authoritarian, or would have succeeded at doing so. What is certain is that he has simply lacked the numbers to give it a try. Indonesian democracy has thus passed its sternest test by defeating a likely aspiring authoritarian at the ballot box, rather than trying to restrain him after he has gained presidential powers. This leaves illiberal democracy as the main lingering threat to Indonesian democracy. Whereas electoral authoritarianism would see an elected leader stifling political opposition, illiberal democracy in Indonesia would most likely see him attacking religious minorities as second-class citizens. It is here where egalitarian nationalism has mattered most, and must continue to hold the line against those who would undermine it. In both the 2014 and 2019 presidential campaigns, Prabowo began assembling an alliance of conservative Muslim forces for his battles against the PDIP and Jokowi. This pattern had already begun to emerge in the 2004 and 2009 campaigns, when Yudhoyono curried favor with conservative Islamists in his successful efforts to trounce Megawati and her more pluralist electoral coalitions. Yet Prabowo raised the religious sectarianism to another level. This increasing religious polarization showed its greatest effect in 2017, when Ahok was defeated in his gubernatorial re-election campaign and subsequently imprisoned for insulting Islam in the wake of massive protests to bring him to justice for doing so. The defeat and imprisonment of Ahok sent chills down the spine of every believer in Indonesia's ethnic and religious pluralism. The looming question in the wake of Ahok's jailing was whether the Islamic mass movement that arose to bring him down would then succeed in 2019 by doing the same to Jokowi, removing a president from power who hews to pluralist nationalism rather than Islamism. Jokowi prevailed in that contest, but perhaps by tilting further in the direction of illiberal democracy than his pluralist backers preferred. Most importantly, Jokowi replaced old Golkar stalwart Yusuf Kalla as his running mate, selecting a deeply conservative Islamic leader from the NU to become his new vice president. The clear goal was to inoculate himself from religious attacks without squandering his overwhelming support among pluralist nationalists. Although the Islamist rhetoric was even stronger in 2019 than in 2014, it was almost surely more muted than it would have been if Jokowi had not protected his Islamic flank as he did with his controversial choice of running mate. In fact, the main difference between the 2019 and 2014 votes was that Jokowi gained overwhelming support from followers of NU, especially in Central and East Java, after basically splitting the NU vote with Prabowo in the 2014 campaign. Additionally, Jokowi's stupendous advantage over Prabowo among non-Muslims, who are especially numerous in Indonesia's outer islands, became even more pronounced in 2019 than in 2014. In regions such as Bali, where the population is predominantly Hindu, Jokowi secured over 90% of the vote. It is thus clear that Jokowi was able to tap into Indonesia's deep reservoirs of egalitarian nationalism, a nationalism in which Islam plays a major role, but never a solitary leading role, to save both his own presidency and, arguably, Indonesian democracy. In conclusion, Indonesia's democratic success is as fragile as it is impressive. Its success at avoiding state failure, military takeover, and electoral authoritarianism by no means ensures that it will continue to succeed at staving off the nastiest features of illiberal democracy. If Indonesia's pluralists cannot continue to defend the egalitarian version of the nation that the country's revolutionary generation first defined, Indonesia will surely follow further in the footsteps of so many other democracies that have turned sharply illiberal in recent years, including my own personal Tanah Air, the United States. Thank you so much again for inviting me to speak today, and I'm so very sorry I'm unable to join you for the entire event. Thanks.
There'll be a tweet about that. Thank you. That was a wonderful reflection, and now we're about to hear another one. We're blessed with the presence of Bapak Endy Bayuni, whose face will be well known to you from the various Q&A sessions he's had on our television screens. Of course, he's very well known in Indonesia as the senior editor of the great Jakarta Post, and he's held prestigious fellowships in America and has even written for the New York Times. We're very grateful that he can speak to us today at this update, but I'd also like to pay tribute to the immense contribution he has made to increasing understanding in Australia about Indonesia and vice versa. It's been immense. Thank you, Pak Endy.
Thank you, Virginia, for the kind words. I'd like to thank ANU for inviting me to this Indonesia Update 2019. I find it intimidating when I got the invitation that I have to speak before a bunch of scholars and a large audience, and very critical. So thank you, Tom and Eve, for putting me as the last speaker to give the concluding remarks. And Virginia assured us that there's no Q&A. Before I begin, allow me to give you 3 quick caveats so that you know where I'm coming from. First, unlike all the other speakers, I'm not a scholar. I'm not going to pretend to be one, and I'm not going to speak like one either. I speak as a journalist. That's my profession for the last 36 years. Rather than using studies, surveys, I'm relying on my reporting of Indonesia in all those years. Second, I'm not unbiased. I have personal as well as professional interest in the well-being of Indonesia, so I do not represent the government, and I won't pretend to claim to represent the Indonesian public. Those familiar with my writings, my commentaries, op-ed pieces, know that I take very strong positions on issues like democracy, freedoms, and human rights. The Jakarta Post and myself, we put ourselves as representing a tiny minority of Indonesians who see ourselves as progressives. Third and last, I'm an optimist. I have to be. The moment I become pessimistic about Indonesia, I will emigrate to Australia.
Oh dear.
But maybe not Canberra. It's too cold. Now, to my concluding remarks, after following the presentations and the discussions all day yesterday and this morning, they have all been great and very enlightening. Some of the problems and challenges disturbing, but I think there were also bright pictures from some of the speakers about the future direction of Indonesia. So, being an optimist, I believe that for every difficulty there is an ease. So there is a solution for every challenge that we face. So I have 5 points to make, short remarks. First one is the question whether is it a decline, a regression, or just some setbacks. The second point I want to make is that the majority of Indonesians still have faith in democracy. I think Mas Burhan made a reference to that. And then I will talk a little bit about the illiberal democracy and the early warning signs that we have heard. And my fourth point is I will dwell a little bit on the polarization issue. And fifth and last, we'll talk about the rise of Islamism. And then my conclusion. So first point, is Indonesian democracy in decline? The short answer is yes. But I had to take exception to the title of this conference, Indonesian democracy between stagnation and regression. I wrote a commentary in Jakarta Post last month, basically criticizing the doomsayers and naysayers who are giving Indonesian democracy a bad rap after the election. There were many of them, and I did make a vague reference, not specifically naming ANU, but I made a reference to the title of this conference as an example. I may be wrong, but to me the word regression gives the impression that we have reached a turning point, and as far as our march to democracy is concerned, that from now on things will only get worse. And this could be true. And certainly we hear early warning signs that here in this conference, many early democracies have rolled back on freedom and basic rights. Look at our neighbors, the Philippines and Thailand. Two early Southeast Asian democracies. Look at the Arab Spring countries and look at many other established democracies. As someone who has followed and written about Indonesia's march to democracy for over 36 years, I refuse to accept that we are regressing or stagnating. The optimist in me sees these problems as setbacks, some huge setbacks for sure. But going by the trend since the last decade of Suharto's rule, democracy is still marching, not in a straight line, but more a case of 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. Sometimes, as if for a variation in dance, you take 5 steps backwards. But the trajectory is always, we are moving forward. My second point, underpinning my optimism is the April general elections where we saw an 80% voters turnout. The elections were not perfect, but they were democratic, free and fair. The violence happened after the elections, not during the campaign or during the elections. And I'd like to think that these results were based on informed choices, like all the elections we have had since 2004, 2009, 2014. Voters knew full well what they were getting into. In a recent discussion in Jakarta, once I asked the audience to name which other countries can brag about a higher voter turnout than Indonesia. Someone mentioned Australia. It's 90%. So I rephrased the question. I said, name another democracy where voting is voluntary with a higher voter turnout. I don't think you can find one. Whatever explanations we have for that 80% voter turnout, there are many, many explanations. I take this as a testament to the faith that people have on democracy, at least beginning with electoral democracy. But I'm glad Mas Burhan also confirmed in his survey that people still have strong faith on our democracy, even among the losers. There is also a belief increasingly embedded in society, in public, that every problem that Indonesia faces today must be resolved through the democratic processes. In the last 20 years, Indonesia has built and reformed the institutions necessary for democracy to function. The political system, the bureaucracy, the judiciary, law enforcement, also important, and the public accountability of these institutions. They are not perfect by any measure, but I think they are strong enough to be able to address problems without the nation or the government resorting to authoritarian measures. In democracy, we get the leaders we deserve, and 80% of Indonesians, voters put their faith on these elected leaders to fix our problems. If they fail, we have 2024 to look forward to. And we have been doing this for the last 20 years. My third point, it would be remiss of me to ignore the problems and challenges Indonesia is facing. Some of them were highlighted in this conference. I agree with most speakers that Indonesia is an illiberal democracy, and I'm glad to hear Dan Slater dismissing the three other elements that can break down democracy: a failing state, military takeover, and election authoritarianism. But I think signs of these three are there. Military takeover, there is a return to militarism on a small scale. Election authoritarianism, I think something that Marcus mentioned about executive authoritarianism. And failing state, I think the problem we see this morning about the rise of vigilantism, the police, law enforcement agencies fail, and that it's, if we don't deal with that, I think we can actually become a failing state. We're still a long way, but I think the early signs are there. We are seeing the polarization of society. We are seeing the rise of radicalism, intolerance, particularly religious intolerance. We are seeing outright persecutions of minorities, not just religious minorities, but the LGBTQ as well. And now we are seeing problems in Papua. These are some of the early warning signs, which, if mishandled, could lead Indonesia towards a failing state, military takeover, or return to authoritarianism. I don't think the Indonesian public is going to allow that to happen. They still have some control over the direction of the country, not just at the polling station every 5 years, but also as long as free speech is observed, they have their voices to air grievances and demand accountability from the elected leaders. My fourth point is about the polarization. We've been discussing this very thoroughly since yesterday and a little bit today. For me, it remains to be tested if this is going to be a permanent feature of Indonesia, the Indonesian political landscape, or is this something that had just happened in the last 2 elections? If you recall, we have had a 2-horse race in presidential race, and the same horses for the last 2 elections. So we were polarized in 2014, and this polarization continued to 2019 because the same candidates were running, the same groups, so they were attacking one another. I'm sure there are polarizations happening, but I think it would not have been as pronounced as because of the fact that we had a 2-horse race and the 2 same horses. We look at 2004 and 2009. 2004, we had 5 candidates running for president. 2009, we had 3. There was a little bit of polarization, but not as much, or not as pronounced. Now, 2024, I think we look forward to at least a different horse, maybe several horses, and I think that polarization would probably not be as pronounced as we are seeing today. My 5th and last point is, let me pick on one particular problem that I have been observing and writing about: Islamism, or the rise of Islamism. The April election gave a resounding no to Islamism. Again, Mas Burhan also mentioned that. Islamism here, I define as the move towards an Islamic state or the use of the Sharia as the law of the land. The combined votes of parties with Islamist platforms, PKS, PPP, PAN, and I guess PBB, amounted to less than 20%. Now, I take this as still the best measure, call it a referendum, of how much support Islamism has in Indonesia. And the figure has been consistently, low, 20%, 25%, I think one election. But it never matched that the figure that they reached in 1955 election was close to 40%. Marcus made a reference to a survey that shows that 27% of Indonesians support Islamism. That's higher, but even then that still gives a majority of 73% of Indonesians rejecting the concept or the idea. There have been, and there will always be, Indonesians who support the idea of Indonesia becoming an Islamic state. My mother is one of them. And the number vary from time to time, but they are never a majority and unlikely to become majority. Not in my lifetime, I guess. Still, we have to respect those aspirations, because those are legitimate aspirations, political aspirations, and part of the democratic political landscape in Indonesia. Suharto, for 30 years, he banned Islamism, and what they did, they just went underground, difficult to detect, and we have problems with terrorism and all this coming from that. Now, beyond Islamism, there is the problem of religious extremism, radicalism, and the rise of conservatism. Extremism and radicalism are for the law enforcement agencies to deal with. They have done a good job in dealing with extremism, countering terrorism, but the police should do a much better job in fighting or dealing with radicalism. We get, I think from the presentation this morning, the vigilantism, police seem to be allowing criminal groups to get away with crime. Now, many people in Indonesia mix radicalism with conservatism, and I think that's wrong. They may be related and they may work in cohorts, but they require different solutions. Radicalism is for police to deal with, but how do you deal with the rise of conservatism? I don't think anyone has come up with a solid answer to that question. 5 years since Martin van Brunissen raised the alarm in the 2013 book about the conservative turn. I have been hearing people complaining about the rise of conservatism as if this is a problem for the police or government to fix. That would be an invitation to authoritarianism. We are already seeing this with the ban on Hizbut Tahrir. Indonesia is not an open society, and to use Andrew McIntyre and Doug Ramage title of the article, Seeing Indonesia as a Normal Country, a Democratic and Pluralist Country, was written in 2008. So Indonesia is an open marketplace for all ideas and ideologies. We are an open society. Conservatism is gaining ground in Indonesia, not by the use of force, they use intimidations, threats, but largely by winning the hearts and mind and the soul of the people. I have been a passionate reader of the culture wars in the United States, and I believe a kind of culture war is happening in Indonesia, except that for the liberals or the progressive sides in Indonesia, they have been weak or even asleep. They need to wake up and fight back. It's a battle that needs to be resolved through the democratic process. Culture wars in Indonesia, that would be a great thesis for a PhD student. So in conclusion, I agree with much of the points raised in this conference. Indonesian democracy is doing well relative to many other countries, but we should not sit on our laurels. We have many problems and challenges to deal with. The next 5 years will tell us whether we are really regressing or we are just having a temporary setback. The democratic environment is not perfect, but I think it's still good enough for Indonesia, its leaders, and its people to deal with them. We may have problems on many fronts, but as long as we have free speech, as free speech is respected, we still have our voices to raise and discuss these problems and maybe even find the solutions for them. Thank you.
What a wonderful way to end our conference. Experienced, thoughtful, fair, first-hand comments. Thank you very much, Bapak. I would like, before calling here Tom and Eve, who are about to come, I'd just like to take 1 minute to read a quotation which I've extracted from Mas Gun, Gunawan Muhammad. This was in Tempo 2000. Can you stop thinking about Indonesia for a while? Yesterday this question came to my head. I wanted to say, yeah, sure, why not? But Indonesia always comes, Indonesia always knocks. Memory, experience, engagement. These words all show that when we think about Indonesia, we don't only know and draw conclusions, but we stand with joy and sadness, with anxiety and hope. And I think that's how you left us too. So thank you very much indeed. I'd like... Eve and Thomas, on behalf of all of us, I would like to thank them. Every speaker has thanked them for the incredible job they have done. I'm just speaking on your behalf in general. It has been an exceptional update. The number of you who have stayed till the end absolutely proves that. So congratulations to Eve and Tom. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Virginia. And now it's also my turn, on behalf of Eve and myself, to offer a vote of thanks to many people who need to be recognised. I'd like to start with just a personal note of thanks. In addition to what Virginia said, I'd like to thank Eve Warburton. She's been the most professional, collegial, and competent and capable co-convener I could ask for. So it's been a real pleasure working with her throughout this process. Thank you, Eve. I'd now like to just thank some institutions that make the update possible every year, have made the update possible now for 37 years, which is quite a remarkable achievement. Firstly, to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which always supports the update. To the Australian National University, of course, and specifically to two institutions within the university, the first of those being the ANU Indonesia project. Particularly, I'd like to thank Blaine Lewis, the director of the Indonesia project. So thank you, Blaine. And also our wonderful administrative staff who have handled the incredibly complex logistics for this update, who have always been very responsive to us as conveners. And those individuals that I'd particularly like to thank are Lydia, who's up the back. Thank you, Lydia. And Nuka. Also, Ruth. Where's Ruth? Maxine and Olivia. So thank you all. And also the Department of Political and Social Change. Our department, I'd like to thank a couple of individuals in particular, Ed Aspinall, Marcus Mietzner, and Greg Feely, who've provided fantastic advice throughout this process for Eve and myself. So thank you. I'd now like to move on to thanking the marvellous volunteers. All of you here, I'm sure, will be aware that we've had people running around with microphones, taking registrations at the door, and basically ensuring that this update functions over the last couple of days. And those volunteers are, and please hold your applause until the end, even though they all do deserve a round of applause individually, but just for time's sake. Tui, Joseph, Juventus, Riza, Ming Chin, Rahmi, Kim Lee, Andri, Wasisto, Megan, Charlie, Eka, Vina, Epifanio, Lucas, Wiraditma, Lina, Rizky, Realita, Belinda, and Baskara. Thank you all very much. I hope I haven't left anyone out. Good. It's also fantastic because I do notice that there are a couple of people here who I've taught in the past, and it's fantastic that they're actually still involved in Indonesian studies. So thank you. I'd next like to thank all of our fantastic speakers. As Virginia said, it's been a really fantastic set of panels that we've had. We were very lucky to have an outstanding keynote presentation by Alan Hicken, which I think really set up the terms of this conference and allowed us to think very clearly and deeply about the issues that have been raised. And also, of course, Ed and Marcus's political update, which delved into the issues of democratic stagnation, potential democratic regression in the context of the 2019 political competition. So thank you all speakers. Thank you particularly to our fantastic keynote and political update presenters. Additionally, you will have noticed that we have many early career researchers who participated in this update. That was a conscious effort on our part, and I hope that you would share my view that this update demonstrates, I think, bright bright prospects for Indonesian political studies going forward, which I think is fantastic. Finally, of course, I must thank all of you, the audience, for coming along, for supporting the update, for providing a community in which so many of our speakers have said they feel at home and able to speak to sort of an informed group of people. We have had some great questions, of course, from all of you. So thank you all very much, and we do hope that you will come back next year. Thank you all. And finally, I'd like to invite Blaine Lewis, the director of the Indonesia project, to come up to say a few words. Thanks, Blaine.
Thanks very much, Tom. Okay, I guess everybody is well thanked now, so I won't have to do that again. Thanks very much. I just have two tasks. A very simple one first is to remind you that lunch will be served immediately after here, after we're finished, but only for those of you who have anteed up the fee. And that, sorry, and that'll be held over in the Coombs extension again. Yeah. The second task is to introduce you to, in broad terms, to the Indonesia update for 2020. As it turns out, I'm going to convene that update myself. It's a little bit, you probably heard that it's often said of politicians that they are always running for office, and we at the Indonesia Project are always planning the update. So we've already begun for next year's update 2020. So I just want to introduce it in very basic terms. Here is the working title for next year: Politicians, Institutions, and People's Money. Political economy in Indonesia. That's just a working title. I may make it a little bit more provocative as we go forward. Just to give you some possible themes that we'll tackle at the update. Some of these I've discussed with potential presenters, and some of them I have not discussed. As you'll see some of the themes, you may see yourselves reflected in some of these themes. And I've talked to some of you. I have not talked to everybody, but I'll begin doing that soon. So here are some broad themes that we might tackle. One is the political economy of policy reform. This would just be looking at general principles of how political economy affects policy reform, both in terms of the constraints that it imposes and perhaps the opportunities that it affords from time to time. And then we'll try to unpack a little bit how DPR works in terms of its decision making, particularly with regard to how the budget is formulated and improved. That's quite an interesting one, actually. Many people will see the DPR as just kind of a black box, and we hope to unpack that a little bit. And then we'll look at some political economy in terms of sectors or functions that are performed by the government in general. I've highlighted education, health, and security, the army, the military, and the police, for example, just as possible examples. And then we'll look at the politics of central government taxation and intergovernmental fiscal relations. You know, the major question here to ask is, what are the politics behind the central government's inability to raise taxes? As we heard in the economics update, that the tax to GDP ratio is very low in Indonesia, and there are some good political reasons as to why that's the case. And we'll also look at the politics behind the the low performance of intergovernmental transfers, both in terms of design and implementation. It's quite a dysfunctional system, and we'll try to unpack why that is, and especially why it's difficult to reform those intergovernmental fiscal relations. And then turning to the district, the subnational level, we'll look at some district pork barrel spending, the impact of corruption cases on district spending and service delivery. In this case, we'll consider the the copycat corruption cases as a proxy for corruption more generally. I actually have a student who's working on that. District political budget cycles, that is, for those of you who don't know, is sort of how governments change their spending behavior as the elections draw near. And then we want to have a look at incumbency advantage and the performance of second-term mayors. That's actually something that I'm working on personally. The 2% solution, what can we learn from Indonesia's best performing districts? Recently, when Sri Mulyani, the Minister of Finance, was down here, she made kind of oblique allusion to this 2% of local governments that perform well. So we'll try to locate those 10 places or so and see what we can learn from their behavior. The final frontier, village funding, spending, and political accountability. The final frontier is allusion to this is sort of about as far as you can decentralize in Indonesia at the village level. Many of you will be aware that this has just started to happen as of 2015. We want to have a look at especially how things have changed since a rather large influx of money via the Dana Desa has sort of invaded local budgets, and see what that means for political accountability among other things. So this is just sort of a teaser of the kinds of things that we might have a look at next year. There could be others as we move forward over the course of the year. Okay, I just want to leave you, I assume that most of you will understand in very general terms what political economy is. I just want to leave you with two views that may enhance your understanding of what political economy is. So there is the first. In a more substantive way, what we intend to do with this update is to bring together people from both, say, political science and from economics, as long as they are working somehow in the intersection between those two fields. And we'll also invite people who take a more qualitative approach to their research, as well as a more modeling or empirical approach to research. And we'll put everybody into one room, at least on the day. Well, I hope it's only that it just takes a while. My great fear is that it may turn violent, but perhaps Risa will be able to predict whether that'll turn violent for us or not. Low-level violence, yeah, that's right. Okay, and finally, just so you are aware. Just rest assured that political economy is not a real science. It's more of an art than anything else. So anyway, we'll do our best, and hope to see you here again next year. Thank you very much.